Hello, ladies. I am so excited. This is the week that I am preparing to see the wonderful young ladies of the South. So, today we're going to jump back into little plus size modeling, little pageantry, and we'll probably talk still a little bit more about television. So, we're going to go back and forth. In When I got to New York, I think if you look at some of the earlier tapes, I started off with talking about how 9/11 affected me to get back into plus size modeling, pageantry, um, etc. But there was a brief time before 9/11 that I had some other experiences that I'll share with you. And the first is, I think I told you about coming from DC. I started looking into acting, and I started at a place, Central Casting. And then I ended up with an agent in New Jersey, shows in New Jersey, Boscov's. And I was actually commuting back and forth from Washington, D.C. to New Jersey. And then I was also introduced to the talk show circuit, which I don't want to break the fourth wall, but there wasn't a lot of jobs for plus size models, for plus size actresses. So a lot of plus size actresses ended up on either fillers or guests or segments on different television programmings. So that's how I got offers from the Maury Povich show and the Montel Williams show. And I declined a lot of those offers because at the time I was working in television news. And as I explained before, I had to make a choice. Are you going to do the casting, or are you going to go to work? And I chose to go to work and not do a lot of the talk shows that were offered to me at that time. Around, I think it was 1998, Emmy, who I met a couple years ago, I guess more like almost 10 years ago, had just bursted onto the scene. And around that same time is when I started to investigate the New York market for plus size models or plus size modeling. And one of the things that I did, which it's so ironic that we're in March because it was my birthday month, I went to open calls in New York City. And I wasn't that familiar with how everything was laid out in New York at the time. So I actually rented a limousine for my birthday week, and I went to these different open model calls in a limousine because I figured, I think it was actually hot that time. Like if I got sweaty, I could change my clothes, powder my nose, get prepared to go from one open call to another. And for those of you who don't know, agencies have open calls for you to come in to see if they want to select you. So I went to Wilhelmina, I went to Ford, I went to pretty much every major modeling company in New York City, and it was fun because I made it a fun experience. But one of the things made it a fun experience. This was when Emmy just burst on the scene. So what I was actually hearing was that most of the agents, most of the work, they were looking for someone who looked like Emmy, basically to model for Midwest catalog companies. So they were looking for your Christy Brinkley type in a plus size version that looked like Emmy. They didn't want you to be too shapely. They were looking for white, blonde-haired women. They were not looking for minorities at the time. And they were definitely not looking for minorities that kind of looked different ethnic-wise, or not the places that I was going to. Other models may have had other experiences. Uh, You also got pointers. Wilhelmina might tell you, well, this season your look doesn't go for us, but maybe Ford has your look. Um, uh, when you go out on open call, they'll tell you different things. A lot of times people ask you, do you need the photographs? I would say yes and no. If you don't have thousands of dollars to spend on photography, photo shoots, and nowadays things are being done quite differently because we have Instagram and social media. But it kind of makes sense to either do test shoots to practice or uh, to develop a book at some point to show your best talents. So I would say it's half and half. No, technically you don't need pictures to go in, but just like having a resume to go in for a job interview, you might get a little bit more of an edge over the other candidates when looking for modeling jobs. So back to the limo. So yes, I was in New York City going from one model call to another in a nice stretch limo during my birthday week, which for those of you who know me, around my birthday time, I like to rent limos. I ended up meeting, because it was open call season, so there were several women going to different model calls, and we ended up making it almost like a little party. Two of the girls, plus size girls who were going from agency to agency, I invited them to come in a limo, and we just had a good old time going back and forth. So from going to the open calls, I did get one or two modeling agents. One was called Plus Model Management at the time. And that was really the only main agent that was taking like a lot of different plus models. So this was the first time I went out for like a group open call process. So I'm going to jump the story a little bit. Coming into 2000, I was working for actually a .com company that still dealt with news. It was a ticker similar to Pointcast that was unobtrusive to the desktop. And what does that mean? It means that it had like this little running tape of information that we were developing for computers to put the computer news pieces together. So I was in a kind of 9 to 5 traditional format. So I decided, well, I wasn't getting a lot of work from this plus model agent. Maybe I'm missing something. So I said, well, why don't I start from scratch? Maybe the look has changed. Maybe they've moved away from the Emmy look. So I decided to start from scratch. And I ended up going to Barbizon Modeling School in New York City. Now, as I said, I actually went to a modeling school almost, I guess it was almost 8 years prior to going back to a modeling school. But I figured I was in a different city and maybe things worked a little bit differently. So it was time to kind of get that graduate school training in the industry. Even though I had already been a professional model, I had already done print, I had already done runway. By that time, I think I had did a little bit of professional acting. So I went to Barbizon, and Barbizon, I wouldn't say is for everyone. And also to note that Barbizon is a school. It is a school program. I think the biggest thing Barbizon did for me is, one, I became a certified model instructor. And two, it dove more into fashion. So the modeling schools that I went to really talked about how to model, how to wear your makeup, how to present in front of agents, etc. And then I got specialized personal training because I was recognized and someone took me under their wing. The Barbizon School focused on all different aspects of modeling, but what was different and most helpful for me was that it actually started to talk about the different styles, like what an A-line skirt is, different trends in fashion, because a lot of times models get into modeling and they don't realize that you really need to also educate yourself on the fashion industry. So I got into more of the technical things. At the end of my school process, I did get the certification, and I did end up receiving, I got noticed, I think either from a teacher or maybe it was the last event. So I did end up, that might have been Plus Model Management, that agent. I did end up getting an agent shortly after that. The next thing that happened was I started to get serious about, and I think that stemmed from the school going to Barbizon, because at the end of doing a show, I actually did my traditional poetry that I was known for while I was in college, doing a lot of Maya Angelou. And they said you really should look into acting, going to an acting school. I said, well, I minored in acting in college. And they said, no, that's totally different. You need to go to an actual acting school. So then I started to do research to see what was the appropriate acting school. So I had narrowed it down to TVI Studios. And my appeal to TVI Studios was that there was a school in New York, and there was also a school in California. There might have been a school in another location. So I figured if I started the programming there, I could go to possibly a school in California if I liked it, etc. But I was doing this at the same time that I was also working. The school was different in the sense that there were casting directors. You were being taught and trained by the people who are selecting people for commercials, for soap operas, for movies, etc. So one of the casting classes, the gentleman's name was David Cady, who also had his own casting school, and he was known as the producer or casting person. I think it was a producer for the original Miami Vice. And this story is fresh in my memory because in the last week, they've been talking about Oprah and Weight Watchers. And I think I heard Wendy kind of slam the concept of Oprah on Weight Watchers. So it reminds me of my experience with Weight Watchers in acting. So I remember asking and having a conversation with David Cady and asking him what the industry was really like, if he thought the industry was going to open up for plus size models, plus size actresses. So he said, this is interesting. He was very interested, and he said, well, let me get back to you. Let me see what's available. And towards the end of going to classes, he said, well, I want you to come out for a thing that I found. And I said, okay. And he said, it's for Weight Watchers. That's what they have for plus size model and actresses. So I came to his casting call for Weight Watchers. And I did the skit that they requested. And then they took pictures, so they wanted a picture of you front ways and sideways. And they were a little hesitant because they were kind of looking for someone who had more of a barrel shape And for a plus size model, I kind of have the plus size hourglass shape, or it was more hourglass then. So they were kind of hesitant, but they called. I did get a call back, but it was like a call back for standby, and they wanted to explain to me that in order to participate in the commercial, I would have to go away for 6 months, because that's how they do their before and after shots, for, or at the time that's how they did it for Weight Watchers. So you would have to like pretty much give up your routine, your schedule, your job for about 6 months, to do this gig. And it paid really well, but I had to make a choice, and I chose to not do it because I needed to keep my job. We'll come back to a couple more acting stories, experiences on my journey. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about television, news in particular, and kind of switch gears. There are a lot of young people that are starting broadcasts online, or do what we're doing here, where we're having conversations, and or they do things like webinars. I myself have a television cable streaming talk show, and I also have an internet radio show. Being that I've done both traditional broadcasting and social media, or the new platforms that we have for media, I think it's important, especially for younger people, to understand some of the differences in discussion. Several years ago, almost, I guess, 7 or 10 years ago, I was at my aunt's, and HBO Sports, I think it was the Costas show, had came on. And there was a traditional sports journalist. I think they were a journalist for Sports Illustrated. And then there was, at the time, they were actually, I think, Gen X, not so much a millennial, with a company called, don't quote me, I think it was Deadspin. Basically, it was a website, or internet site, which we now refer to as apps, that carried sports news stories. And I remember I just was talking about some of the changes in media and broadcasting to my aunt, and there we were talking, but we noticed how passionate this journalist was becoming. He was so upset that people were going to this website for these traditional sports news stories, and it was a very intense conversation about sports journalism, but really an intense conversation about journalism in general, if you've ever worked in it. And I think what's important, because I don't think this is really necessarily being taught, when you say you're a journalist, journalists had what's called a journalistic creed. I think the best way, being a broadcaster, being a journalist, was explained to me at its history, at its core, at its root, was when I was an intern at WRC News 4 NBC. And there was an anchor by the name of Jim Vance, who was one of my mentors. And when I asked him about his journey, I believe it was him who told me that it was a service job. They were looking for, and I've had a couple journalists from that time period pretty much say the same thing. They were looking for work, And this was labeled, broadcasting was labeled as a service job. And a lot of them were teachers, or worked in other fields that were coming into journalism. They weren't necessarily trying to be journalists. And I think there was a difference in the education at the time because it was still kind of a new format, so to speak. So what does that mean, service job, right? So a service job would be comparable to your firemen, your police officers, your teachers, and people that work in municipal court, people that are servicing the community, servicing the nation, so to speak. So even though journalism and broadcasting and news and media has changed due to ratings and sensationalism and competition and everything else, and it is kind of sad to see young people today, but at the same time exhilarating because of what it's kind of turned into, grabbing microphones away from journalists. And yes, do they have the right to be heard? Yes, we have a whole social media platform for young people to be heard that may not be working at the traditional networks, who, yes, in some cases have been proven to not always tell the entire story. But there are journalists out there who do. But what I want to bring it back to is to understand that this is a service job, meaning they are supplying, or were supplying, important information to the public. Bad weather, um, uh, information about politics, yes, information about events and sports and things like that. But they were really providing information for the public as a service. So the thing that you may not realize sitting in your comfortable home on your couch doing your broadcast, or a friend who happens to have something that looks almost like a studio and you're doing your broadcast, or you're doing your Facebook Live, or you're doing your Periscope, is that a true traditional journalist took an oath, a creed. And part of that meant risk, taking a lot of risks and taking a lot of sacrifices. And what does that mean? It means that if you really want to walk up to a traditional journalist and start comparing yourself to them, you need to ask yourself a couple of questions that traditional journalist has probably been involved in. The first question you need to ask yourself is, are you willing to risk your life for a story? Because a journalist that, for example, is covering a war story is risking their life. A journalist that is covering a story, for example, I was in a crossfire when covering a story. We went to, I think it was Anacostia, Washington, D.C., to a story where a child had been killed in a crossfire. And while we were covering the story, a crossfire broke out. So ask yourself, is that something you're willing to do? Second thing you need to ask yourself is, are you willing to sacrifice? Because you're going to sacrifice birthdays, holidays, time with your family and friends. And especially in the early stages, that time won't even exist. because your average journalist, traditional journalist, has done those things. They've missed birthdays. They've missed holidays. They've been working on those days, providing you with news and information. So you need to ask yourself, are you willing to sacrifice that time? I think the third thing to really understand is that with the sacrifice of your personal time, it will inevitably be reflected on your personal lives. So essentially, your personal relationships end up with a certain amount of sacrifices. So back to this HBO sports show that I was watching with my aunt, where the traditional journalist, was angry, livid that people were going to an internet site that a person was not taking these risks necessarily, or had sacrificed their time, or had made personal sacrifices, and that they had a 30, 40-year career of that. So that's something to really keep in mind when you're comparing your broadcast from the comfort of your home or your friend's cool studio, because it's very different. And it's also not about just looking cute in front of a camera with some cute clothes. It's serious work. It's serious business. And you need to understand the difference and then make the choice of where you want to be in the process. But I don't want to discourage young people of becoming journalists that go out and do stories the way these stories are usually done. But it is something to really think about when you're pursuing that career tracking. There are also exhilarating, exciting, amazing moments. I mean, you will meet all kinds of people, from politicians to entertainers. I've had all these experiences as well. There is a positive side to what you're doing. So, media. There have been so many changes and transitions. I think eventually we're going to see more of, we're kind of seeing it now, almost a C-SPAN format, because we all have cameras and there are so many cameras already out there. So we'll probably continue to have forums of conversation, being able to judge what we're seeing from the angle that we can see. So that's going to change aspects. But we're still going to probably need a certain amount of service to the community, so there isn't any chaos. So this week, I will be seeing the young ladies of the South. I can't wait to meet you all.